This will be a recording of my memories of Grandma and Grandpa Heitkamp and miscellaneous information in connection with the family, which I thought might be of interest to the descendants. Ernest Louis Heitkamp was born on March the 4th, 1824, in Altzey, A-L-T-Z-E-Y, Hesse-Darmstadt, Germany. He died in Brooklyn, New York, 1912 or 13, in his 85th year. He was the son of Charles Philipp Heitkamp and Lisette Jung Heitkamp. Jung Heitkamp. His maternal grandfather was Philipp Jung, who was a miniature painter and had an art gallery at Worms near Frankfurt am Main in Germany. His father, Charles William Heitkamp, and Lisette Jung Heitkamp emigrated to this country around 1830 and settled in Brooklyn, New York. He had one sister, Emma, who married Count Rosetsky, I think that's the name, who was a Hungarian count, a little dubious background, and evidently didn't work very hard because my grandfather used to refer to him as the Noah Count. Now, Grandma Heitkamp was born Mary Sedam in New Lots, which is Flatbush, a part of Brooklyn, on May the 5th, 1830. She was the daughter of Henry Sedam and Anne Bayless Sedam, and her ancestry was Dutch and English. Father's side was Dutch, and they settled in New Amsterdam in the beginning of the 17th century. Her mother's side, Baylisses and Bergens, were also Dutch and I think partly English, and they settled also in the Hudson Valley in the early part of the 17th century. Her genealogy on her mother's side I have, and it's in a book of the St. Nicholas Society, of which I was a member, which traced ancestry back to those days. This will qualify any female descendant as a member of the colonial dames of the 17th century, and will qualify any male descendant for the St. Nicholas Society, which is an ancestor worship society based in New York. Grandma Heitkamp had one brother, John Howard Sedam, who was a Dutch Reformed minister, and he was chaplain of Rutgers University, and had a charge in Rhinebeck, which is in the upper Hudson Valley in New York. He was a fine-looking, portly gentleman, well-whiskered, and with a gold chain around a very prominent girth. Grandma Heitkamp died in sometime in 1926 or 7. She was, at the time of death, she was 95 years old. This completes the biological sketch. Grandfather Heitkamp followed with his father the profession of bookbinder and marbler. A marbler is a process which is used on the fly pages and under the cover, which gives them a marbling appearance. He had a shop on Pearl Street, which was in Lower Manhattan, corner of Fulton Street. And he would commute there by ferry from Fulton Street, Brooklyn to Fulton Street, New York. He later moved his shop up a little bit when traffic moved north to Reed Street. I do not know when he retired, but it was probably at the end of the century. They were married, by the way, in 1851 and celebrated their golden wedding anniversary in Brooklyn, New York at 295 Claremont Avenue in 1901. The ancestral home, 295 Claremont Avenue, is located in what is known as the hill section of Brooklyn, as distinguished from the Heights, which was down on the river. It was nearby to Fort Greene Park. The house itself, built by our grandfather, was of red brick. It was the only red brick house in the neighborhood. All the other houses in the block and other blocks were of brown stone. It was semi-detached on one side with an alley that went forth. Structurally, the house had a basement, which was a little bit below the ground level, and which was the dining room, and back of it was the kitchen, and the back of that was a vestibule. On the first floor, which was reached by a stoop from the street, was the parlor in the front, and followed in the back by a library which went the entire width of the house, and at which end was a fireplace, and then you could step out by French doors to a veranda. There was not much to see if you went on the veranda. I don't know why it was built, because all it did was to look out on the backyards of your neighbors and their Monday wash. The second floor contained the bedroom in the front, which was occupied by Grandma and Grandpa. Another room behind, it was connected by a little hallway, in which was a wash basin. And then at the end of the main hall was the bathroom. The second floor, or the third floor, had 4 bedrooms. A small one in the front, which I occupied, a larger one in the front, my sister occupied, and then in the rear another bedroom, which at the time I moved in was occupied by my Uncle Fred. That had a little alleyway between with a wash basin. The other end of the hall was the maid's room, a very small room, but also in the hall you had a door. You stepped up 2 steps and closed the door, and there you were on the throne. A house was heated by a coal-burning furnace, and the coal was shooted down through an open chute in the front of the house, and it was hot air with ventilators. There was no electricity. It was high gas light. This completes the structural part of 295. Grandpa retired, I don't know, at the end of the century, and on his retirement, his family had moved away. There was nobody to take care of the old people. So he asked my mother and father if they would move in and occupy the house and take care of their elderly parents, which my mother was only too happy to do. This was about 1902 or 1903. In those days, it was customary to take care of the elderly in that manner. There were no retirement homes, at least to my knowledge. Well, I must have been about 9 or 10, I guess, when we moved in. My impressions at that time were of Grandpa was a fine-looking gentleman, well-whiskered, and a medium height, and broad-shouldered, and he stood up very straight. The first thing I remember was the fact that he wore Prussian boots. He never wore shoes. the boots would come up over the ankle. He was very proud of them, and he would shine them, and then he would put them in a footstool, which I still have, which was made just for Prussian boots. He also was a cigar smoker and inventor. And one of my early duties was to run down the corner to the cigar store and buy him his cigars, which were small cigars. I think they were made from cigar savings. They were known as stogies. And he would smoke them right down almost to the butt, and then put a knife in there and hold it so he'd get the full value for his money. He was a baseball fan. The Brooklyn Dodgers, and those names were called the Superbas, were played at Washington Park, which was about a mile from the house. And grandfather had a box seat right behind first base, and he would attend there regularly. I remember him saying, the only trouble with those Superbas is they don't know how to bat. But anyway, I went with him a couple of times, and I do remember one of the famous baseball players of the day was named Honus Wagner, and he was a shortstop on the Pittsburgh team. And as I remember him those days, he had a bow leg. And then there was another famous group at those days, the Chicago team came on, and they had an infield which was well known as Tinker to Evers to Chance. That was the double play combination. But I'd walk with Grandpa. He'd put a cane over his shoulder like it was a musket, and that's the way he would stride along. And I'd little 12-year-old boy, 14-year-old boy tagging at his heels. He had been a member of the National Guard, 16th Infantry, I believe, and a lieutenant. And we had a photograph of the company with him at the head with the other officers, which my mother presented to the regiment after Grandfather's death, and they were very glad to receive it. The saber that he carried now possession of Ted Heitkamp, Fred Heitkamp's son, and his dress sword I have, and that's in the possession of my daughter Marion. He did not serve in the Civil War. He was a Democrat, a state right Democrat. I think they call them copperheads in those days. I don't know why, but at that time he had 2 or 3 children, and I suppose that may have been an additional reason why he didn't serve. Rather than go back and record this tape, I will debate now and give the names and of the children of Ernest and Mary Heitkamp. A profile of each of them is given in an interview which I had with Cousin Nell while she was in retirement in the nursing home here at Montclair, in which she gives a profile of each member of her family. That is the first generation, and so I will not go in details there, but I'll do these just merely for recording. The firstborn was Charles William, named after his grandfather, who married Julia Moffett. The second, I believe, were the twins, 2 twins, boy twins, who died in infancy. Then came Anne, named after her grandmother, who married Eben Storer. I don't recall whether I have the first name correctly. The third was George, and he married Ella Ritson from Buffalo. The fourth was Mary, and she married Charles Patterson, and they subsequently moved away to New Orleans. The next was my mother, Emma Lulu, named after her aunt, who married the Count, and she married Charles Miller. Her was Howard Saddam, who married Lillian Grimshaw. Following him was Ernest Louis Jr. He did not marry. He died in his late 20s after contracting pneumonia during his service in the Spanish-American War. His fiancée, Emily Slater, often joined the family reunion. The next in line was Edward Sweet. His middle name came from the restaurant which Grandpa used to eat regularly on Fulton Street in New York, known as Sweet's, and it's famous for its fish food and is still in existence. And the last was Frederick, who married Pearl Atherton. The most vivid, of course, of my memories was the Christmas gatherings, which were held at 295 and was made very much of in accordance with the German tradition. With a large family, of course, there were large gatherings. And my early impression, of course, of coming down at Christmas morning and under the tree and picking out my gift, which was, remember the Rover Boys or the Barber Boys at Yale, Merrillville stories. And I used to say, my golly, I read that in an hour and then had to wait a whole year for the next volume. The grandfather had a stand for the Christmas tree, which was quite unique. It was the form of a mill. I think he had it built himself. And there was a pool in the front, and you would take the water and pour it in the top. It would go over a wheel and come down into the pool, and then you could pull it up again, so it could be repeated. The candles which were on the tree were wax candles, and of course they were dangerous, and grandfather would have to pace up and back and forth before the Christmas tree to keep the people away in case there might be an accident to cause a fire. The festivities consisted mostly of family talk. Cousin Florence would play the piano, and dinner was served down in the basement at the main table and little small tables in the corners, and then the children would come down for the second course, second helping, when the adults could come up. Now, this whole Christmas day is well documented in a tape recording by my cousin Fred, which I have and which I hope would be read at some time and available to any one of you who would like to have it, as copies are being made. There was a talent, artistic talent in the family, which may have come from Philip Young, the miniature painter. But Uncle Charlie, that's the firstborn, was a good copyist. He painted also in oil. His son Ernest had a talent for sketching and drawing. Then Irving Heitkamp, that's the son of George, was a fine artist, and he has paintings which I think some of the family have, and at least I have one. And he died quite young, unfortunately. I think in his late 20s or early 30s. He was frail health. Then Bessie Rockmore, that was Mary's daughter, Aunt Mary's daughter, also was talented, although I don't know that we have any examples of her work. Cousin Florence was a commercial artist. She illustrated a collection of Robert Louis Stevenson's Child's Garden of Verses. She was employed by Dresser and Stone, and married her boss, Louis Stone. I don't know where the artistic came from. They certainly are not inherited in my branch of the family. Probably goes back to Philip Young, the miniature painter. Ella Ritson, that is George's wife, also was a talented person, and her daughter Mary, cousin Mary, was a fine pianist. and Florence also could play the piano. Now there are some portrait paintings of the family. Grandpa and Grandma had their portraits painted by an itinerant artist in those days, shortly after they were married. By giant-sized portraits there are. The one of Grandpa is the possession of my niece, Natalie, and the one of Grandma is in the possession of my son, Charles. Their parents, Charles Heitkamp and the young Heitkamp, also have their portraits painted, and one of them is the possession of my niece, Natalie, and the other one in the possession of my niece, Jean. Now his grandparents, that is Philip Young and his wife, are in my possession. They were painted, portrait painted about 1770, I would guess. There's also daguerreotypes, daguerre named after the photographer in those days before we had photography, which I have one of Grandma, and the other one is in possession, I believe, of Ted Heitkamp, that is Fred's son, out in the West Coast. The photograph of Grandma and Grandpa Heitkamp and their 6 sons were taken at the time of their 50th wedding anniversary. This will give you a fine indication, good indication of Grandpa and Grandma as I remembered them. And also, if you will look at the photograph carefully, you will discover the Prussian boots. I think I will just ramble on a few reminiscences, not only of Grandpa, but of the family, if you will bear with me. First comes to mind is my cousin Ernest. That's Charles' oldest son, his only son. And he was an individualist in the first character. Cousin Nell used to say that when he was a young man, he didn't go to college. I think he probably dropped out of high school, but he would disappear. And then he would show up in most unexpected times, sometimes a lapse of months and even years. He was a journalist, freelance journalist for a while, and then he became associated with the Hearst papers. He was war correspondent for the Hearst papers in London during the World War II. And he suddenly had to leave because of his name being Heitkamp. People suspected him of a German sympathy. He returned to this country. He married an Italian girl while he was over there. But when he got back here, she was dissatisfied with America, didn't like the people, didn't like the food, I guess. But anyway, she got up and left Ernest and went right, left home. But Ernest didn't faze him at all. He married a second time, Ruth Brown from Chicago, who became a very devoted wife and took care of him in his eccentricity. One of which is demonstrated by the fact that when he stayed at our home while we were abroad one summer, he was taken with a slight heart attack to the hospital. He became restless and said he wanted to go home and told his wife to get the tickets, plane tickets, and then he just packed up and left the hospital. But he got to Chicago and then on to Indian Wells without incident, and he lived to be 97 years old. And the fact is, I think he died the way he lived. He just wouldn't have anybody help him. He was sufficient unto himself, although he was almost blind. I think he was struck by a car. Anyway, he died a rather tragic death, fell in line. Of course, we all know Cousin Nell. I don't have to go into details about what a wonderful feminine person she was, strong will and the kind of a person that you felt very much at ease of when you talked to her, and she lived the fond old age of 103. There's a story of her when she entered the nursing home. She was an inveterate smoker, and she smoked cigarettes, didn't inhale it, but she had a long holder. But as she was getting blind, she was a little bit unsafe about lighting the cigarette. So that was the reason for the long holder. But anyway, when she got to nursing home, they said, no smoking. Cousin Nell said, that's it. Gave it to the nurse, and that was it. Philosophical. And better than that, she was feminine. Membership in that society. Grandfather was an inventor. He invented a process for marbling the paper, which was used in the book binding, and had it copyrighted. And incidentally, there was another inventor in the family, inventress it was my mother. She had a copyright, patented a method of folding bandages, which she used in World War I when she was active with the Red Cross. While I'm on the subject of my mother, she was Cousin Nell said that she should have been a man. She had a very positive outlook on life, high principles in questions of religion and morals, especially in the matter of temperance. She took literally the admonition to don't let the word whiskey ever pass your lips. Whenever she had occasion to use it, she would say W.H. She adored her father, and her last wish was that she would be married in the Heitkamp plot in Evergreen Cemetery, and of course my father had to go along with her. They are both buried in a common grave. And incidentally, that plot in Branson was bought by grandfather. There's a good-sized monument there, and in it were the twins that died in infancy, and grandma and grandpa, and I think several of the sons are there, and my mother and father. I wouldn't recommend anybody going to visit except in an armored car. There is another cemetery connected with the family, and that is grandma's grandparents, the Bayless family, which is in Sweet Hollow Cemetery, which is in Melville, in Long Island near Huntington. That might be worth a pilgrimage. The old Bayless homestead is nearby. We have in the files here an account which is extreme interest of my grandma's early days as a child in her life in Melville with her parents and grandparents on a Sunday, which recounts from morning till night the series of church meetings and prayer meetings and lunches and other social atmosphere of that day. Grandma and Grandpa spend the summer vacation with their family at Ellenville, which is in the Catskills. And Mother tells me that he designed a tennis court there, on the first tennis courts, grass courts, and there is a picture somewhere of the players. And the women, of course, in long skirts and, my God, probably hats. But anyway, they weren't in shorts, that's for sure. Well, Grandpa was a severe disciplinarian, according to my mother. Anybody that misbehaved at the table, he'd yell, "Scallywag!" and they'd disappear under the table. That is the name Heitkamp is translated as warm meadow. The name itself is being carried forward only by the descendants of Howard Heitkamp, and that is Fred and Donald Monroe, who's disappeared, and Howard, who I think has his son Peter, and then the ones on the West Coast. So the Heitkamp family landed in Brooklyn, and the portion of it bearing the name are now in California. So go west, young man. Go west. Well, if you're ever in that neighborhood, it would be worthwhile to get in touch with Ted and Helen and see the portrait painted by Irving of our grandmother sitting on the horsehair couch sewing, a beautiful painting of a beautiful woman, and by a fine artist. Incidentally, I rescued that painting. It was in the possession of Carol Heitkamp, and after her death, her husband, John McCandless, asked me who it was. He said he was going to dispose of it. Fortunately, I took it. I gave it to Fred because my mother had given it to his father, her brother Howard. Well, just rambling along, there's another story told about grandfather. He commuted regularly to his business back and forth by ferry across the East River. When they built the Brooklyn Bridge, he refused to commute that way. He said the bridge, in his opinion, was unsafe. These memories are continued on side B. Turn the cassette over and rewind. To supplement what I have said on the reverse of this cassette, starting with Uncle Charlie and his family, Cousin Nell and Arlene, her sister, married brothers, Will Crapp and Charlie Crapp. They were orphans. They emigrated from England and went in business with their uncle, a man named Stanley, in manufacturing of commercial soap, Quaker Soap Company, with offices in Secaucus in New Jersey. Will Crapp was a very tall and fine-looking gentleman. He and Nell made quite an interesting couple, one over 6 feet and the other about 5 feet. Arlene spent most of her life as a librarian with the General Electric Company, at the offices in Manhattan, Lower New York, and she became interested in finance, in connection with investments, and was a constant reader of the Wall Street Journal. And as a result, she made a successful career of investing and died with a comfortable estate. She married Charlie Crapp late in life. They lived in Montclair for a short time. He predeceased her. Arlene lived to be 97 and ended up in the Van Dyke Manor in their Ridgewood, New Jersey home. The information about Uncle George and Aunt Ella are quite sketchy. I remember Aunt Ella, of course, when I made her home my headquarters and in leave during World War I. She was a most attractive lady. After their divorce, she ran a boarding house in Bensonhurst. It shows her courage, and I think she died in Paris and quite happy in her final years. George moved to Chicago, Illinois. I don't know whether he remarried or not. He seemed to have dropped out of the family at that point. Now, Aunt Annie, I remember principally because she used to wear a black ribbon around her neck. And she took care of Grandma in Grandma's final years. She was widowed a second time, having remarried a man named McDonald, who had a milk route in Brooklyn. Milk was ladled out from milk carts in those days. I wish I could give you something more about Aunt Mary and Uncle Charlie Patterson. Of course, I lost contact with them as a young boy when they moved to New Orleans, and only heard indirectly that they lived in Charles Street and that their home had a balcony. But Howard, their son, was in Cincinnati, and I met him at my mother's 90th birthday in Indianapolis, and recalled him as a very fine-looking gentleman with curly hair, and his wife had the unusual name of Melissa. That's about it. My mother, Emma Lulu, married Charles Miller. He courted her for a period of 6 years, from 1886 till 1892, during which time he was educated at Columbia University in New York City and received his BA there, and also a postgraduate course, and received a degree of Bachelor of Laws, and graduated from the law school in 1892. I have to imagine 1888. Because he waited around until he had enough money to marry mother, and he had a series of cases involving water cases, he called them. The city of New York was digging wells on Long Island and undercutting the celery growers out there. And father represented the celery growers and was able to secure damages for a great many of them. That gave him enough money to start business and get married. I have given you a profile of my mother on the main part of this Gazette. My father, as an attorney, of course, was consulted on all legal matters involving the family. He, by the way, practiced as a loan practitioner in Lower Manhattan for over 60 years. And while I was practicing also in Lower Manhattan, I often passed the place where he had his offices on Nassau Street when he started out all by himself. Took a lot of courage in those days. The next in line is Howard Sedan. Well, the only thing I remember offhand about that Howard was that the story goes that Lillian Grimshaw was a very beautiful young lady in Brooklyn, and some of his brothers told Uncle Howard that he'd never be able to get a wife as beautiful as she was, and he said, well, I'll get her, and he went after her, and that was the story of Uncle Howard and Lillian. Uncle Howard was employed with the Gilbert Manufacturing Company, which was a textile house in the Midtown Manhattan. A home was in Chatham, New Jersey, and he was the superintendent of the Sunday school, I remember, and I think active in the club life there. I visited their home, Fred being about my age, in several occasions, and at one time the family, when I was quite young, boarded in Chatham at the family by the name of Snook. All I remember about Mr. Snook was he had a lot of whiskers on his face, and that he used to serve the dinner. When apple pie came along, he'd say, apple pie without cheese is like a kiss without a squeeze, and everybody would laugh at that joke. The only other thing I remember is that we had chicken for dinner, and that he cut chicken's head off on Saturday night, and I watched that and watched him also picking it by dipping the fowl in hot water. I hope this isn't too gruesome for you all. Mr. Snook had a daughter, Amelia, who I guess was my first love. I remember she was quite fat and I think rather pimply faced. My cousin Fred, I'll remember, he, I guess, was the most successful of all of that generation. He was spotted out in business with the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company. And by the way, my roommate at college, Fred Geyer, was the son of the founder of that company, and he had met Fred while Fred was at the YMCA training camp during World War I. He never got into service. He later on became president of several corporations, and finally the United Wallpaper Company, which merged with Sears Roebuck. And on his retirement, he moved to Indian Wells, California, where he hobnobbed, as I think I've said, with the greats like President Eisenhower and Arnold Palmer. Donald, the second son, was rather short and had red hair. He married and lived for a short time in Montclair while we were there, but later he moved away to South Jersey and disappeared as far as I was concerned. Howard, the third son, married Elizabeth, I forgot, Betty they called her, and he was in business in Ohio, I believe, and their children, I think Peter and the others I don't recall, but Peter's still around and bears the Heitkamp name here in the East. Carol, the younger daughter, married John McCandless and died under tragic circumstances. I met John at the time of Carol's death. I think I've recorded that on the other side of this Gazette. I think Uncle Louis I may have met once. I have a feeling that he was one of the family gatherings when he was just before he went up to Saranac Lake, where he was being treated for consumption and where he subsequently died. I recall him as rather good looking too, as most of the Heitkamp boys were. Edward, that is Edna's father, I have very little recollection of him. He was employed in various capacities, I remember, in Brooklyn, and I think he had twins who died before Edna and Mary were born. They lived in Brooklyn, and I think he's buried in the Heitkamp family plot. Uncle Fred, I have a very distinct recollection of him. When I first moved to Claremont Avenue, he was there, and then from there he married and lived in New Jersey, became a New Jerseyite in Glen Rock and Montclair, Upper Montclair at one time. He had graduated from Cornell University and played baseball and also tennis. His nickname was Height. He's a member of the Psi U fraternity, which is the same as my father, so they were brothers in fraternity. He died under very tragic circumstances, of heart attack, while vacationing with his family in South Jersey. Aunt Pearl, his wife, I have referred to before, a fine lady with background, school teacher, and brought up her two children, as we all know, in good style. Well, this concludes my recollections of the first generation, and incidentally I've included some of the second generation. And before I conclude the second generation, I might refer to my immediate family. My sister, Natalie, married Malcolm Moore in Indianapolis, a general agent for the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company, and he also died in a tragic death, a heart attack, while sitting with my sister in the bench in their home in Indianapolis. And my sister, with the great courage and perseverance which I admire, she brought up her two daughters in good style also. My sister met Malcolm when he was on duty as a naval ensign at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and he came to church at the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church, and my mother, who was always on the lookout for somebody to entertain at dinner, asked him to come up and have Sunday dinner with them at Claremont Avenue. And there, of course, he met my sister Natalie, and the romance developed. So 295 Claremont Avenue was the scene of a romance. Digressing for a moment on the artistic trait in the family, I failed to mention Harold uh, Heitkamp, who was the son of George, a fine-looking gentleman, as I remember. I only think I saw him once or twice. A gay bachelor, I'm told, and he eventually moved to Buffalo, where his mother's roots were. But he did a copy of a Rockwell painting of a rain-soaked fisherman in a dory named Sport, and it's a fine picture, and now is in the possession of Irving Post, his nephew. While on the subject of that family, the youngest was Eleanor, and she moved with her mother when mother moved to Paris. And as I mentioned before, I went on leave. I stayed with Aunt Ella, but later on, in July of 1919, I participated in the Victory Parade, which marked the Allied victory in World War I. And after the parade, I joined Eleanor, and we did the boulevards together. And I remember distinctly having had, I guess the next day, on the left bank, a dish of raspberries and cream. Well, I enjoyed Eleanor very much, Irving. She was a grand lady. Another memory which digresses a little bit is Aunt Annie. As I said before, she married a second time, and Alexander Campbell, who had a milk route in Brooklyn, New York. But the memory I have of her principally is that she always wore a black ribbon around her neck. A most gracious lady, and it seemed to fit right into her character. As I've mentioned, her daughter Florence married Louis Stone, who, by the way, had a glass eye. He was quite liberal-minded, and I remember they used to taunt my father, who was much of a conservative, on all political and moral issues. It annoyed my father a great deal, as I remember. Her other son, George, died fairly early in life, and that's Eleanor's father. And I only remember him in a slight way. There is one other matter in connection with the family, and that is cousin Nell's passing. At the Van Dyke Manor, where she resided in retirement, there was a large beech tree in the front lawn, very large and very graceful, and she would sit and admire it from the window, and also in the summertime from the porch, and she expressed the wish that when she died that her ashes be spread under that tree, and I saw that that was done. Regressing a moment back to Ernest, when he was relieved of duty as war correspondent, he joined Mr. Hearst in Chicago with the Chicago American, became a friend of Mr. Hearst, and Mr. Hearst asked him to pass on the antiquity of the furniture that he was buying for his home in California. I do remember Ernest coming on one day, because he was then made editor of Golf. Golf was in its infancy. And he went by the house when he called, came up to the house in a green coupe car, and with a big word, "Height for Golf." Oh, I'm one of the early golfing enthusiasts. Our cousin Mary, George's daughter, went with her mother to Paris when they were in the divorce, and there she studied piano, became a pianist. She married a man named Wager Swain, who was an American living in Paris. Evidently, the family in Connecticut didn't know much about Mary, because I know it was Mary or Wager gave my name as a reference. So they contacted me through a partner in our firm, and I assured them that Mary was my cousin and she was not an adventuress. They subsequently returned to America and lived in San Francisco. I called on them there in 1950, And I remember Mary as a very outgoing, smiling lady with short hair, frizzly hair, which of course is what a pianist should wear. Cousin Jenny Kazine was an orphan which Grandma and Grandpa befriended and became practically a member of the family and joined in on all our reunions. She married a Kazine, Mr. Kazine, and he went to California right after the gold rush to seek his fortune and disappeared and never heard from. Cousin Jenny subsequently remarried a man named Jack Wiley. His head was as bald as a billiard ball, whereas Debbie on the side of his head, and he had a whiskey breath, which annoyed my mother no end. There should be included in these memories the family resulting from the remarriage of grandmother's mother when Henry Saddam died as a result of a fall while he was building a house in Brooklyn. She remarried a man named John Wortman, and there was one issue named Emma, from whom my mother was named. Emma, in turn, married Richard Spears, and they had 3 children. Marjorie, very beautiful, married Clarence Miller. Henry, who was a life insurance salesman, I believe, in New York, and Lansing, who was my age. They attended all our family reunions as members of the families because they were, of course, half cousins. There is one memory of Richard Spears. He was short, and at the Christmas gatherings, he would appear and entertain the children by striking pennies with a hot poker. And he had stiff cuffs. We all wore stiff cuffs in those days. He had them bound with elastic so he could pull them down and snap them back. Well, that amused us all very much. There is a conclusion, I think, properly so, of the Golden Wedding Anniversary book, which was prepared by the children and presented to Grandma and Grandpa on their 50th wedding anniversary in 1901. Every child and grandchild and in-law contributed, either by a sketch or a quotation or a greeting or a memory. And that book is now, I believe, in the possession of the Heitkamp Archives in California. The concluding page showed the elderly couple sitting together, hand in hand, and Cupid at their feet with a sling of arrows over his shoulder and looking up at them. And the title to the watercolor was The Last Guest. And the artist, who do you know? Cousin Nell. With this picture in my mind and in your mind, I will conclude these memories, hoping that they have been a source of information to you and enjoyable. And I will now sign off. This is Cousin Dudley in his 94th year, Pax Vobiscum.